Ethan had always dreamed of escaping the noise of the city for a few days of solitude. When he found an old, remote cabin in the mountains available for rent, he didn't hesitate to book it. The weather forecast was calm light snow and low temperatures, nothing he couldn't handle. The drive up was uneventful, and by the time he reached the cabin, dusk had already started to fall. The cabin was simple but cozy, a wooden table, a small fireplace, and a single bed tucked in the corner. As night descended, the snow began to fall more heavily, swirling outside the windows. Ethan wasn't concerned. He had plenty of supplies and was looking forward to spending a quiet evening by the fire. By midnight, however, the storm had turned violent. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing, and the snow piled up rapidly, pressing against the windows. Ethan noticed something strange when he glanced outside. The forest, so full of shadows earlier, seemed unnaturally still, as though the storm had frozen it in place. Then he heard it, a faint, scraping sound coming from beneath the cabin. At first, he dismissed it as an animal. But the sound grew louder, moving from one corner of the cabin to another. It stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. Grabbing a flashlight, Ethan tried to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. He opened the trapdoor that led to the crawl space under the cabin, shining the light into the darkness. Nothing. Just dirt and old wooden beams. He closed the trapdoor, locking it tightly, and went back to the fire. The scraping sound didn't return, but now something else caught his attention, a set of footprints in the snow outside the window. They were large and deep, leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin. Ethan froze. He hadn't heard anyone approach, and the storm should have erased any tracks within minutes. He grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. The wind roared louder, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw something, a shadowy figure just beyond the edge of the clearing, too far to make out clearly. Then the light flickered. The fire sputtered. Something knocked on the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Ethan's pulse quickened as he stared at the door. For a moment, he debated whether he'd actually heard the knocks or if his mind was playing tricks on him. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest. Who would be out here in the middle of a snowstorm? The knocking came again, this time, louder. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed the fireplace poker, his only weapon, and moved cautiously toward the door. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he aimed its beam at the wooden planks. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky. No answer. The wind screamed outside, rattling the windows. The snow pressed hard against the glass, making it impossible to see anything beyond the swirling white. "Hey! If you need help, say something," Ethan shouted, hoping to sound confident. Silence. He hesitated, then slowly reached for the doorknob. The metal was ice cold under his fingers. With a deep breath, he turned it and cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. The icy wind slapped his face, stinging his skin. But there was nothing there, no person, no footprints in the fresh snow, just the howling storm. He scanned the clearing with his flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the snow. Relieved but uneasy, he shut the door and slid the bolt across. As he turned back toward the fire, a loud thud echoed from above. His head snapped up. Something or someone was on the roof. Ethan's legs felt heavy as he moved toward the center of the room, gripping the poker like a lifeline. The sound of footsteps creaked overhead, slow and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was wanted him to know they were there. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, without warning, the hatch to the attic, which he hadn't even noticed before, dropped open. A cloud of dust and cold air swirled into the room. Ethan stumbled back, his heart hammering. "Who's up there?" he shouted, angling the flashlight toward the dark opening. Something shifted in the shadows above, a faint movement, just enough to send a jolt of terror through him. And then, in the beam of light, he saw it. Fingers. Long, pale fingers gripping the edge of the attic opening. Ethan's grip on the fireplace poker tightened as his mind raced. Those fingers were unmistakably human, but their unnatural pallor sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound firm. The fingers curled, pulling the rest of the figure into view. What emerged from the attic wasn't a creature of folklore or nightmares, but a person, a man, emaciated and filthy, with wild eyes and tangled hair. His skin was paper-thin, almost translucent, and he looked like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. "Don't hurt me," the man croaked, his voice weak and raspy. Ethan took a step back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. What are you doing here?" The man lowered himself from the attic, his movements slow and unsteady. He wore ragged clothes that barely clung to his skeletal frame. Ethan could see his breath in the freezing air, and it dawned on him that this man, whoever he was, wouldn't survive much longer without help. "I got trapped," the man stammered. "Storm came in too fast. I found this cabin. Hid up there. Didn't know if anyone would come." Ethan's fear began to give way to suspicion. "How long have you been here?" "Days. Maybe longer," the man said, swaying slightly as if he might collapse. Ethan lowered the poker but didn't let go of it entirely. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" The man's eyes darted to the door, then to the windows, as if expecting something or someone else to appear. "Didn't know if I could trust you," he muttered. The wind howled louder outside, rattling the cabin. Ethan realized the man's gaunt appearance wasn't just from hunger, it was fear. "What's out there?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes locked with Ethan's, filled with a terror so profound it made Ethan's stomach drop. "It followed me," he said, "through the storm. I thought I lost it. But it's out there." As if on cue, a loud, deliberate knock echoed through the cabin once more, freezing both men in place. This time, the sound came not from the door, but the window. Ethan turned his flashlight toward the frosted glass. A shape loomed just beyond the snow-covered pane, tall, indistinct, and eerily still. And then, slowly, the knocking started again. The plan was simple: a group of friends, a weekend in the mountains, and the challenge of conquering Ridge Peak. Nate, Emily, Jason, and Sarah had been planning the trip for months, their gear meticulously packed and spirits high as they set out early that morning. The trail was steep, cutting through thick pine forests dusted with fresh snow. The forecast had warned of light flurries, but nothing that would deter their climb. Ridge Peak was known for its stunning vistas and relatively safe ascent, making it a popular destination for experienced hikers like them. By midday, they had reached a clearing where the forest thinned, opening up to a breathtaking view of the valley below. The snow glittered under the pale winter sun, and the air was crisp and biting. They paused for a break, sharing energy bars and water while discussing their route to the summit. "Storm's supposed to pick up later tonight," Jason said, glancing at the sky. Clouds were starting to roll in, their edges tinged with gray. "We'll be down before then," Nate assured him, tightening the straps on his backpack. "We're making good time." The group pressed on, the trail becoming narrower and the incline steeper as they ascended. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped noticeably, and the wind began to pick up, swirling loose snow around their boots. Emily was the first to notice the sound, a low, distant rumble that seemed to echo off the mountainsides. She stopped, frowning. "Did you hear that?" she asked. The others paused, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the whistle of the wind and their own breaths puffing into the cold air. "Probably just the wind," Nate said, though his tone lacked conviction. They continued climbing, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The snow beneath their feet felt looser now, the trail less defined. Jason, who was leading, stopped abruptly and turned to face the group. "We need to be careful here," he said, pointing to a section of the slope ahead. "This area's prone to avalanches. Stay spread out and move quickly." The group nodded, their previous chatter replaced by focused silence as they followed his lead. They moved one at a time across the open slope, each step deliberate. Halfway across, the rumble returned louder this time, and closer. "Move! Now!" Jason shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. The ground beneath them seemed to shiver, and then the sound grew deafening. A massive wave of snow broke free from the slope above, cascading down with terrifying speed. "Run!" Nate yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar. Panic set in as they scrambled for safety. The snow was relentless, a crushing force that consumed everything in its path. Emily slipped, falling to her knees as the avalanche barreled toward them. "Grab her!" Jason shouted, reaching back just as the wall of white crashed over them. When the snow settled, the mountain was silent once more. The silence was eerie, almost oppressive, as the snow finally stilled. What had once been a clear trail was now a blank, featureless slope. Pockets of disturbed snow lay scattered, but the rest was packed tightly, like cement. Nate was the first to emerge. He had been thrown to the side of the avalanche path, partially buried up to his waist. His chest heaved as he clawed his way free, coughing out cold air that burned his lungs. Panic surged through him as he scanned the slope. "Jason! Emily! Sarah!" he shouted, his voice raw. The only response was the distant wind whistling through the peaks. Nate forced himself to move, ignoring the ache in his legs and the biting cold. Then he saw a hand motionless, barely sticking out of the snow a few yards away. "Emily!" he cried, scrambling toward it. Digging frantically with his gloved hands, he uncovered her face. Her eyes fluttered open,
dazed but alive. "Nate," she whispered, her voice weak. "I've got you," he said, his voice shaking. "Hold on." Emily was pinned beneath the snow, but her breathing was steady. Nate worked quickly to free her legs, his heart pounding as he constantly checked the slope above for any sign of another slide. Once Emily was out, they both turned their attention to finding the others. "Jason was behind me," she said, her voice steadier now. "I don't know where Sarah was." The two of them called out, their voices echoing against the surrounding cliffs. After a few agonizing minutes, a faint sound reached them, a muffled shout. "This way," Nate said, leading Emily toward the source. They found Jason half buried under a mound of snow, his arm pinned awkwardly behind him. He was conscious but in pain, wincing as they dug him free. "My shoulder," he groaned. "I think it's dislocated." "Where's Sarah?" Emily asked urgently, her eyes scanning the endless white expanse. Jason shook his head. "I don't know." She was further up the trail when it hit. A wave of dread washed over them. They had no choice but to keep searching. Nate grabbed the emergency beacon from his pack and activated it, hoping it would help rescuers locate them. "Sarah!" Emily shouted again, her voice breaking. A faint sound reached them, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. They followed it desperately, their pace frantic despite the exhaustion. Finally, they spotted her bright orange jacket peeking out of the snow near a cluster of rocks. She was buried deeper than the others, and it took all three of them to dig her out. Sarah was unconscious but breathing, her face pale from the cold. Jason checked her pulse, relief flooding his face. "She's alive." Nate looked at the darkening sky. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the storm was worsening. "We need to get down the mountain," he said firmly. "Now." Emily nodded, cradling Sarah's head. "How?" "She can't walk, and Jason's hurt." Nate looked around, assessing their options. "There's an emergency hut lower down, about 2 miles from here. We have to make it there. We'll take turns carrying Sarah." Jason grimaced but nodded. "We don't have a choice." As they prepared to descend, the wind picked up, carrying with it the ominous howl of another storm building in the distance. The wind grew fiercer as Nate, Emily, and Jason worked together to secure Sarah. Using a makeshift sling from their packs and ropes, they fashioned a way to carry her between them. Jason, despite his injured shoulder, insisted on helping. They couldn't afford to waste any time. The descent was treacherous. The packed snow was slick underfoot, and visibility was rapidly diminishing as the storm closed in. Each step felt like a gamble, the threat of another avalanche looming with every shift of the wind. "Keep moving," Nate shouted over the howling wind. He led the group, his eyes scanning for the faint markers that signaled the trail. Emily followed close behind, her arms straining under Sarah's weight. Sarah was still unconscious, her body limp, but her breathing remained steady, a small mercy. Jason brought up the rear, wincing with every jolt to his shoulder. Despite the pain, he kept pushing forward, the urgency of survival overriding his discomfort. After what felt like hours, they spotted the faint outline of the emergency hut, a small wooden structure partially buried in the snow. Relief flooded through them, giving them the final push they needed to reach the door. Nate kicked it open, and they stumbled inside, collapsing onto the wooden floor. The hut was barely larger than a shed, with a single bench, a metal stove, and a shelf stocked with emergency supplies. Jason sank against the wall, cradling his injured arm. "We made it," he muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion. Nate immediately set to work. He pulled Sarah onto the bench and wrapped her in emergency blankets from the shelf. Emily found matches and lit the small stove, the faint warmth a welcome reprieve from the biting cold outside. As the stove crackled to life, Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Where am I?" she mumbled. "You're safe," Emily said softly, brushing the snow from Sarah's hair. "We're in the emergency hut. You're going to be okay." Nate crouched by the stove, his face grim. "We'll have to stay here until the storm clears," he said. "The beacon's on, but it could take hours, maybe longer, for rescuers to find us." Jason nodded, his face pale but resolute. "We've got enough supplies to last. The important thing is we're alive." The wind outside howled like a living thing, shaking the walls of the hut. Inside, the group huddled close to the stove, their relief tempered by the harsh reality of their situation. Hours passed. The storm raged on, relentless. As the night deepened, a faint noise outside made Emily stiffen. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Nate frowned, listening intently. At first, he thought it was just the wind. But then it came again, a faint, rhythmic sound. Footsteps. Someone or something was outside the hut. Nate motioned for everyone to stay quiet, his heart pounding as he reached for the metal flashlight from his pack. The rhythmic crunch of footsteps in the snow grew louder, then stopped just outside the hut. The faint beam of light from the stove flickered against the thin wooden walls, throwing shadows that danced like ghosts. Jason, still clutching his injured arm, muttered under his breath, "Could it be rescuers?" Nate shook his head, his instincts telling him to prepare for the worst. He edged toward the door, his movements careful and deliberate. "Stay back," he whispered, his voice low. The door rattled once, then again, as if something or someone was testing it. "Hello," Nate called out, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at him. A pause. Then, a voice, muffled by the wind. "Is anyone in there?" Relief washed over Nate like a wave. The voice sounded human, desperate but not hostile. He opened the door a crack, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. A figure stood there, a man, bundled in heavy winter gear, his face partially obscured by a thick scarf and goggles. "I saw the beacon," the man said, stepping back to show he meant no harm. "I'm with the rescue team. Are you injured?" Nate nodded, stepping aside to let the man in. The rescuer moved quickly, assessing the group and their condition. "Two injured," Nate explained. Sarah here was caught in the avalanche but is stable. Jason's got a dislocated shoulder. The rescuer radioed his team, his voice steady and professional despite the howling storm outside. "I found them. 4 survivors, 2 injured. Requesting an evac as soon as the weather clears." The man turned back to them. "We'll have to wait until first light for the helicopter. The storm's too dangerous for an airlift right now, but my team's nearby. We'll get you out of here." The group let out a collective sigh of relief. Sarah gave a weak smile, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to make it." The rescuer nodded, his calm demeanor reassuring. "You're tough to have made it this far. Just hang tight a little longer." The storm raged on through the night, but the presence of the rescuer gave them hope. By morning, the skies had cleared enough for the helicopter to arrive. The group was airlifted off the mountain, their ordeal finally over. The forest was silent, the kind of stillness that comes just before a storm. For friends Mark, Rachel, Danny, and Claire had set out early that morning for what was supposed to be a quick winter hike. The trail wound through a dense pine forest, the snow underfoot crunching softly as they walked. The weather had seemed perfect, cold but clear, with no sign of the storm that was quietly building on the horizon. By midday, they had reached a small clearing where they stopped to eat. That's when Mark noticed the sky beginning to shift. "Look at those clouds," he said, pointing to the west. The others followed his gaze. Heavy gray clouds were rolling in, blotting out the weak winter sun. The air felt colder, the wind picking up in sharp gusts. "Think we should turn back?" Claire asked, her voice uncertain. Rachel, the most experienced hiker among them, frowned as she checked her watch. "We should have been heading back already. Let's move fast." They packed up quickly and began retracing their steps, but the storm was faster. Snow started to fall in thick, wet flakes, and the wind howled through the trees, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they made them. Visibility dropped quickly. The once familiar trail now looked like an endless maze of white. "This doesn't feel right," Danny said, stopping abruptly. "Are we sure we're going the right way?" Rachel hesitated, scanning the area. "We have to keep going downhill. That'll take us back to the trailhead." Mark, shivering despite his thick jacket, glanced nervously at the thickening snow. "What if we're going the wrong downhill?" Tension rose as the snowstorm intensified, and the group's movements became slower and more disoriented. Then, a sudden sharp gust of wind sent a branch cracking down behind them. In the panic, they scattered. Rachel veered left, Claire ran forward, Danny turned back, and Mark stood frozen for a moment before chasing after Claire. Within seconds, the forest swallowed them, the storm reducing visibility to mere feet. "Rachel." Rachel tried to call out, but the wind drowned her voice. She stopped, forcing herself to think. She knew the worst thing she could do was wander aimlessly. Instead, she pulled out her emergency whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the universal signal for help. She listened, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Nothing. No response. Mark. Mark ran blindly after Claire, a heart pounding. The forest looked the same in every direction, white, cold, and endless. Her phone had no signal. Desperation creeping in, she started moving again, calling out the others' names. Danny. Danny had turned back, thinking he could retrace their steps, but the snow had already erased any sign of the trail. The cold was biting now, and his legs felt heavy. He clutched the straps of his backpack, hoping the emergency blanket inside would be enough if he had to stop. The snowstorm showed no mercy, and the friends were now completely separated, each battling the elements and their rising fear. Rachel. Rachel's whistle had stopped carrying in the fierce winds. She pulled her jacket tighter and forced herself to keep moving. The wind was picking up, the snow now coming down in blinding sheets. Her phone was useless in this storm, and the battery was low. She tried to remember the trail, but everything around her was a blur of white. She knew she had to find shelter before the storm took its toll. In the distance, she spotted a large fallen tree, its trunk forming a sort of makeshift cave. Rachel hurried toward it, crawling under the thick branches. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her fingers were numb from the cold, but she knew she couldn't afford to panic. The tree would block the worst of the wind, and she needed to rest for a moment, gather her thoughts. She checked her watch. Hours had passed since the group split. The storm wasn't letting up. Her best chance was to wait until it cleared enough to find her way back, but there was a sinking feeling in her chest. The others weren't here. Mark. Mark had sprinted blindly for what felt like hours, but every step took him further from the others. He was starting to lose his sense of direction. The snow was coming down harder, and his legs were beginning to tire. He could barely see anything beyond the white wall of snow and ice, and the cold was gnawing at him. Every breath felt like swallowing needles. The wind screamed around him, and the sound of his own footsteps seemed to get lost in the storm. "Claire!" he shouted again, his voice hoarse, but there was no answer. Desperation clawed at him. He needed to find shelter. He kept moving in what he thought was a straight line, but the trees looked the same no matter where he turned. He didn't know which way to go anymore. Claire. Claire's heart pounded as she pushed through the snow. She was getting slower, her movements stiff from the cold, and the wind kept threatening to knock her off balance. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore, but she knew she couldn't stop moving. She had been calling out for what felt like an eternity, but her voice was barely audible over the storm. Her legs were aching, her breath ragged. The snow was now falling so thickly she could barely see a few feet in front of her. She had no idea where she was anymore. She stumbled through the thick snow and then, finally, she saw something in outline in the distance. Her pulse quickened as she stumbled toward it. It was a small, wooden shack, barely visible through the blizzard. She reached the door and, with shaking hands, managed to force it open. Inside, the warmth of a small fire greeted her. Danny. Danny had stopped to rest by a large rock, his mind clouded with exhaustion and panic. The snow had made his way nearly impossible, and the cold had started to seep deep into his bones. He was shivering uncontrollably now. He knew the others were out there somewhere, but he had no way of finding them. His phone was dead, and all he could hear was the howling wind. He pressed his back against the rock for support, trying to keep his eyes open, trying not to fall asleep. He knew he couldn't let that happen. If he did, he might never wake up. A faint noise reached him, almost imperceptible. He squinted into the storm, trying to locate it. Then he saw it, a flicker of light, a small glow through the blizzard. Without thinking, he staggered toward it, his legs shaky but determined. The morning after. The storm had finally begun to subside by the time the friends found each other, one by one, each stumbling into the small shack Claire had discovered. The walls creaked under the weight of the snow that had piled up outside, but inside, the warmth of the fire was a small mercy. Mark was the last to arrive, his face pale and his clothes covered in a thick layer of snow. He collapsed into the corner of the shack, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I thought we were done for," Rachel said quietly, her voice hoarse from the cold. Danny nodded, still shivering, but alive. "We're lucky to be here." Claire, already curled up by the fire, exhaled shakily. "We need to get out of here as soon as we can." Rachel looked at the group, each of them worn down by exhaustion, but alive. "We'll wait for the storm to pass. Then we'll head back to the trailhead." But there was an undeniable sense of uncertainty in the air. They were alive, but they had no idea what the aftermath of the storm would bring or whether they would make it out unscathed. By morning, the storm had finally settled, though the snow continued to fall lightly, painting the world outside in shades of white and gray. The shack, though a lifesaver, was far from ideal. Its walls were thin, and the fire had long since gone out, leaving only the faint heat of the embers. The four friends, huddled together, were exhausted, their clothes wet from snow and sweat. Claire was the first to speak. Her voice was still shaky, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We need to move. We can't stay here any longer. We don't know if the storm is over for good, and we'll run out of supplies if we don't find the trailhead soon." Rachel, still curled up near the dying fire, nodded. "She's right. We need to get back to civilization before the next storm hits." Danny, who had been sitting quietly, rubbing his hands together in an attempt to warm up, stood up slowly. His legs were stiff from the cold, but the thought of staying in the shack any longer made him anxious. "I can barely feel my fingers, but we'll freeze if we stay here." Mark, the last to speak, looked out the small window. The world outside was nothing but snow and trees, and the trail seemed impossible to find in the whiteout conditions. But there was no choice, he had to keep moving. "We'll have to stick together," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "We'll follow the river. It's usually a good landmark, and it should lead us back to the trail. The group, now bracing themselves against the cold, packed up what little gear they had left and stepped outside. The cold air hit them immediately, biting through their layers. Claire led the way, her steps careful as she maneuvered around the deep snow. The struggle. They trudged through the snow for hours, each step feeling heavier than the last. The trail, if it had even existed, was gone. The snow had completely wiped it out, and the trees around them were all starting to look the same. The river was nowhere to be seen, and the cold, relentless wind stung their faces, making it hard to focus. Rachel kept looking over her shoulder, anxiety creeping into her movements. "We're losing daylight," she said, her breath visible in the icy air. "We have to find a place to camp before it gets dark. We're not prepared to stay out overnight." Mark nodded, but his face was pale, and his eyes were starting to glaze over from exhaustion. "If we don't find shelter soon, we're in trouble." Danny was falling behind. His legs were heavy, and he was having trouble keeping up. "Guys," he called out weakly, his voice cracking, I can't go on like this." Claire immediately turned back, grabbing Danny's arm. "You have to. Just a little longer, okay?" But Danny's body had reached its limits. He collapsed into the snow, his face pale with exhaustion. His fingers were blue, and his teeth were chattering uncontrollably. "I'm not going to make it, am I?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "The decision." Rachel knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she tried to assess his condition. "We can't stop here," she said urgently. "Danny, we have to keep moving. If we stay here, you'll freeze to death." Claire stood up, her eyes wide with panic. "We can't leave him here. We can't." Mark, sensing the urgency, stepped in. His voice was steady, but the fear was clear. "Rachel's right. We need to move fast, or none of us will survive this." Danny, too weak to argue, simply nodded. Claire grabbed his arm, helping him to his feet. The group continued to move, though it was clear that Danny was slowing them down. They had no choice but to keep going. But after a few more steps, they spotted something up ahead, a dark shape against the white of the snow. A cabin. The cabin. The small wooden cabin appeared out of nowhere, barely visible through the trees, almost as if it had been hiding. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar. It looked abandoned, but to the group, it was a beacon of hope. Claire rushed toward it first, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Is it real?" she whispered, her breath coming out in a cloud. Rachel pushed past her and tried the door. It creaked open with ease, revealing a dusty, empty interior, but the walls were solid, and there was a small wood stove in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Get inside, Rachel ordered, already starting to build a fire. We'll be okay. Just get inside. Mark helped Danny inside, and the others followed quickly. Claire, shaking uncontrollably from the cold, collapsed near the stove. They didn't speak for a long time, too tired and too frozen to say anything. Rachel continued to work, building the fire as best she could with the sparse kindling. It took a few minutes, but eventually, the flames began to lick at the dry wood, sending warmth into the room. The group huddled together, close to the fire, not saying a word. They were exhausted, shaken, but alive. The storm outside was still raging, but in this small cabin, they had found the first semblance of safety in hours. The fire crackled loudly, providing the only warmth in the small cabin. The smell of burning would fill the air, and for the first time in hours, the group felt a small sense of relief. Danny, still shivering uncontrollably, sat near the stove, clutching his frozen hands close to the fire. Rachel wrapped him in her spare jacket, her face tight with concern. "How are you feeling?" Rachel asked, her voice softer than before. Danny nodded weakly but didn't speak. He was too exhausted to say much, his body barely moving except for the occasional involuntary tremor. The fire had warmed him slightly, but it wasn't enough to stop the deep cold that had already set into his muscles and joints. Claire, sitting nearby, pulled out her emergency kit, which included a thermal blanket and some basic first aid supplies. She looked up at Rachel. "We need to warm him up more, or he might go into shock." Rachel nodded, already unbuttoning her own jacket. "I know. Just keep an eye on him. We need to be careful with his body temperature." Mark, who had been silently staring at the fire, broke the silence. "We need to think about getting out of here. We can't rely on this cabin forever." Rachel looked at him, her expression grim. "You're right. But we need to wait until the storm clears at least. The snow is still coming down heavily. If we leave now, we might get lost again." Mark sighed, rubbing his face in frustration. I know. He cut himself off, shaking his head. "We can't stay here for long." The night. The fire continued to burn low, its glow casting long shadows on the cabin's wooden walls. The group sat in a tense silence, each person lost in their thoughts. The storm outside howled, and the wind rattled the old structure as if it were going to collapse. But inside, they were safe for now. Danny had finally stopped shivering, his body wrapped tightly in the thermal blanket and a spare jacket from Rachel. He was still weak, barely able to hold his head up, but he had stabilized somewhat. Claire sat next to him, keeping him as comfortable as possible. Rachel and Mark were sitting across from them, still trying to assess the situation. Mark kept glancing out the small window, where the snow was coming down in thick, swirling gusts. He couldn't see much through the whiteness, but he could feel the storm wasn't letting up. "We can't stay here forever," Mark repeated, his voice a little more forceful. Rachel rubbed her eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion pulling her down. I know, but we'll be in even worse shape if we try to move out in the middle of this. We wait for the storm to clear, and then we'll go. We have to trust that we'll find our way back. Mark's gaze softened. He understood, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. Every minute they stayed in the cabin felt like another step further from safety, and he couldn't shake the feeling of panic building in his chest. Finally, they all settled down, huddling near the fire for warmth, trying to sleep. But sleep was a rare commodity in these conditions. The cold seeped into their bones even here, and the howling wind outside kept everyone on edge, eyes darting toward the door at every new gust. The morning after. The storm had finally passed by the time dawn broke. The world outside was a silent, frozen wasteland, and the sun, though weak, was visible in the sky for the first time in what felt like forever. Snow covered everything: trees, rocks, the ground, all of it was a blanket of white. Rachel was the first to wake. She'd hardly slept, but she felt a surge of energy when she saw the clearing skies. She immediately checked on Danny, who was still asleep but no longer shivering. He looked pale, but his breathing was steady, and his pulse was no longer erratic. "Hey," Rachel whispered to him, gently shaking his shoulder. "Danny, wake up. We need to go." He groaned softly and blinked his eyes open, still disoriented. "Where?" "We're leaving the cabin. The storm's over." Danny nodded, too tired to argue, and struggled to sit up. Rachel quickly helped him to his feet, and together, they began to gather their things. The others had already started packing up. Mark was pulling the backpack straps tight, his face grim but determined. "We should head east," Rachel said, looking at the map she had in her pack. "There's a town that way. We should be able to reach it within a few hours if we don't get stuck again." Mark looked at the direction Rachel had pointed. The landscape was harsh, but it seemed doable, as long as they kept moving. "Let's go." The journey out. The first few hours were tough. The snow was deep and difficult to navigate, even with the storm over. Danny, still weak, had to rely heavily on Claire, who stayed close by his side, helping him through the deep drifts. Rachel and Mark kept an eye on the horizon, looking for any signs of the trail or the town they hoped would be there. The silence of the forest was almost deafening, broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow and the occasional creak of trees shifting in the cold wind. By midday, Danny was slowing them down again. He'd started to shiver once more, despite the layers of clothing, and his face was pale. Rachel stopped to check on him. "You need to keep moving, okay?" she said, kneeling beside him. "You're okay, just hang in there." He nodded, but it was clear he was struggling. Claire stepped in, offering Danny her pack. "I can carry this for you. Let me help." Danny shook his head weakly. "I can do it. I just need a second." Rachel exchanged a glance with Mark. They both knew they had to keep moving, but Danny's condition was starting to worry them. The group pressed on, the cold biting at their exposed skin as they trudged through the snow. Danny was now walking with more difficulty, his body still recovering, but the pace was slow. Claire stayed close to him, making sure he didn't fall behind. They had covered a fair distance, but they were all feeling the effects of the ordeal: the cold, the exhaustion, and the fear of not knowing when they would finally reach safety. Around them, the landscape looked empty, endless snow covering the ground in every direction. The sun had risen higher, but it offered little warmth. It was as if time had frozen in place, and the cold was determined to hold on to them. Rachel, leading the way with Mark by her side, checked her map one more time. "We should be close. We just need to push a little further." Mark nodded, though his face betrayed his uncertainty. "I hope so." They kept moving, the rhythm of their footsteps the only sound that filled the air. Every so often, Rachel would glance back at Danny, concern still etched on her face. He was walking slower now, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Claire kept urging him to keep going, but even she could see that he was reaching his limit. The moment of relief. Then, after what felt like hours, they spotted it: a small clearing ahead. Through the trees, there was a faint hint of something movement. The glint of sunlight off metal. "A road," Mark exclaimed, his voice full of disbelief. "We found it." Rachel's heart leaped. "We're almost there." With renewed strength, the group pushed on, the road growing closer with every step. The sight of it, the first real sign of civilization they had seen in what felt like forever, sent a wave of relief washing over them. The exhaustion, the cold, the fear, it all seemed to melt away for a moment. They had made it. As they emerged from the trees and onto the road, they saw a small vehicle, an old truck, approaching in the distance. The sound of its engine was the sweetest sound they had heard in days. Rachel waved her arms, signaling the driver to stop. The truck slowed, coming to a halt just in front of them. The driver, a man in his mid-30s, rolled down his window, eyeing the group curiously. "What are you folks doing out here?" "It's a hell of a storm to be caught in." Mark was the first to speak, his voice hoarse but filled with relief. "We've been stranded, got caught in the snowstorm. Can you help us?" The man nodded. "Get in. I'm headed toward the nearest town." "You look like you've been through hell." "The road to safety." The warmth inside the truck was immediate, a stark contrast to the cold they had endured. As the truck drove along the snow-covered road, the group finally allowed themselves to relax, their bodies no longer in constant fight or flight mode. Danny, still weak, against the window, his eyes closed, as Claire made sure he was comfortable. The man driving introduced himself as Luke, a local who worked as a mechanic. He explained that he had been driving to check on a cabin for some clients when he stumbled upon the group. He'd been surprised to see anyone out there, given how intense the storm had been, but he was glad to help. The ride was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The reality of what they had survived was starting to sink in. They had been lucky so many things could have gone wrong, and yet here they were, alive. A new beginning. When the truck finally reached the small town, the group was dropped off at a local inn, where they were given a room and allowed to rest. Luke made sure they had food and warm drinks before he left, wishing them well on their journey home. As the group settled in, Claire sat down beside Danny, who was finally starting to regain some strength. "I can't believe we made it," Claire whispered. Danny smiled weakly. "Neither can I." Rachel, who had been quietly processing everything, looked out the window at the falling snow. "We'll get home. We'll recover. But we've learned something important." Mark looked at her, confused. "What's that?" "Never take anything for granted. Never underestimate the power of nature." The end of the journey. The storm had passed. The road ahead was long, but they had made it through the worst of it. And though they had been tested in ways they never imagined, the friends had emerged stronger, closer, and with a deeper understanding of the fragile balance between life and nature. They had survived the storm and in doing so, had found a renewed sense of gratitude for every step they would take from here on out.